on our way of understanding things, so from our point of view, we read part of the point of philosophy as celebrated by Michael as being to, as we put it, domesticate conceptually extravagant science, like quantum theory. Michael seems to be waiting for quantum theory to be tamed, in some sense. And a lot of our chapter 1 of our book, we're not, this doesn't notice, this does not say we are annoyed by Michael. This says we are annoyed by the kind of philosophy
that's all right.
We're saying we're annoyed by the kind of philosophy that is exemplified, that is mainly engaged in domestication. Right? It's mainly engaged in the project of domestication. Fundamental physics, we think, aims at literal truth, complete generality, not that it achieves these things. Literal truth, complete generality, in our special sense, which I don't go into here in the book, and ideal objectivity, where we're understanding objectivity in the sense I identified by reference to Janet and that Janet discussed in the first talk this morning. Such physics, notice, physics interpreted that way would tend to crowd out metaphysics. If reductionism were true, then, right, then your physics just would be your metaphysics. And if objectivity carried no information losses, but of course we don't think either of those, we don't buy that antecedent. Or if disunity were true, right, if special science were completely unconstrained by fundamental physics, then metaphysics would also be crowded out. Again, physics would just be your metaphysics. In fact, nothing would be your metaphysics, right? If you do pray, we know it. Now, we don't have any transcendental arguments, transcendental arguments against reductionism or disunity. We just think that those doctrines poorly characterize the actual regulative norms of science. We think they're bad philosophy in Michael's. So, explaining the constraints on special sciences imposed by the content of fundamental physics, given that we do not buy those antecedents, and that we reject reductionism and disunity. Explaining the constraints on special sciences imposed by the content of fundamental physics seems in that sense worthy to us of being called metaphysics. The question which James will stand up and address in a minute, which is still open to be addressed here is, right, might that content, might we actually, by reflecting on the content of quantum physics, might we find within quantum physics the kind of constitutive coordinating principles that Michael associates with Einstein's and Newton. Before I hand over to James, the last slide in which we raise some further speculative questions for discussion. Right? Well, something that might be quite striking and unusual, but I think was hardly plausible, is that the metaphysics as we're understanding it here might itself have a facade-like character. I mean, I think there's a running assumption through most of the history of philosophy that a metaphysical theory should itself be a theory T type thing, right? It should be, I mean, a metaphysical theory should tell you how the world is all at once. Maybe we'll have patchy metaphysics, right? Metaphysics is this aspect of things, and metaphysics. Please remember for us, something is a metaphysical claim just if it says, if it unifies scientific disciplines, if it says something about the way in which fundamental physics constrains other science, constrains special sciences. That's metaphysics. But the constraints on special sciences might be different from one province of science to another. And there might not be an overarching, we might not have an overarching account of those constraints. Can our machines, given the sort of Humphrey's future we envisage for science, can our machines build facades? Right? Is it right to say that if the machine, remember, the metaphysics is coming out the computer, or some of the metaphysics is coming out the computer, do we expect that to be facade-like, or is it better to say that we might construct facades given the output? It's possible, notice, that sound metaphors will arise for local metaphysical propositions or models that would not involve any domestication of quantum theory, right? It might be that, so even if we don't domesticate quantum theory, we don't try to express quantum physics in English, it might nevertheless be the case that the metaphysics we derive from quantum physics might itself be something we can say something about. Now, we have no idea whether that's likely or not because we don't see any inductive basis out there on which to speculate one way or the other. But I'll now hand over to James to say a little bit about what the story might look like if we try to tell Michael's story about quantum physics. Right? The story Michael thinks so far nobody has succeeded in telling.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. I just crave your indulgence for a little while longer. So I was interested in a question, if Michael was right about the constitutive a priori, and if we were along the right lines in everything must go, and these are big ifs, I'll let you decide which you think is the big if, then in order to be possible to both apply Michael's story to quantum physics, so I thought I'll have a quick go at that. And then it ought also to be possible to express the positive content of everything must go in Friedmanian terms. So I'll have a go at that as well. And it won't take very long. So the basis of Michael's view, I think, is that there's a structure to our scientific knowledge that there is a threefold structure in his story as applied to relativity. So there's the empirical laws, the stuff that's actually testable, let's say Einstein's field equations or particular solutions of them. Then there's the constitutive a priori stuff, so the equivalence principle. And then there's high-level philosophical, what he calls philosophical meta-paradigms or meta-frameworks. Now, when I talk about quantum mechanics, I'm going to be trying to give you examples of the second kind of level. And when I talk about everything must go, I'm going to be trying to describe it, to put it in the form of a list of principles of the third kind. Okay? So the kind of meta is very meta by the time you get to everything must go. So let's think about quantum mechanics. Of course, there's no one quantum mechanics. So this is like really first pass off the top of my head. I won't spend a lot of time or qualify or hedge. I'll just throw it out as possible ideas. Things you might think have the status of constitutive principles with respect to Copenhagen quantum mechanics. First one, surely, there are measurements. The results of measurements are described by classical concepts. There's a background space-time structure. There's a non-commutative algebra of operators. There's chancy occurrences in the world. And, importantly, I think, Bohr elevates to the status of a constitutive principle, because it is constitutive in the sense of guiding the development of the theory, the correspondence principle, which itself is derived from the history of science. And Michael says the constitutive principles of later frameworks are contained in those of earlier frameworks, are contained in those of later frameworks as limiting cases. And he says when he talks about that convergence, he's talking about a purely mathematical fact about the corresponding mathematical structures. Now that, as a principle, is actually explicitly incorporated into the methodology, the heuristics of quantum physics. When you quantize, you must take a classical Hamiltonian as your starting point, and you must expect to recover classical physics in the limit of particle number becoming large or Planck's constant going to zero.